So I think I will begin by by welcoming you. This is Professor Rob Ventresca for folks who haven't met him yet. He has agreed to join us today for our Catholic Currents series, part of our series, talking about Vatican II. Excuse me, sorry. So I think it's a real gift to have him a part of our new campus ministry series that we have running. I guess I should introduce myself too. I'm Annette Donovan Pancho. I'm one of the campus ministers here, and I will be your moderator sort of for the day. Rob is going to be speaking to us for about a half an hour about some of the different aspects of Vatican II and its significance for us. At the end of that half an hour, I'm going to encourage people to type into the Q&A section any questions that you may have. I will then read those out loud so everyone can hear them, and we will continue to learn. Professor Rob Ventresca is a professor at King's. He's from the department history, sorry. And at this point, I am going to let you take over the screen. So thank you for your time and being with us today.
Thank you, Annette. Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to share the screen. So Annette, would you just let me know before, is the slide show up? Okay, so I can't hear you, okay. All good?
Yep, it's all perfect.
Okay, and just let me know if something kind of goes astray.
If something goes bad, I will definitely let you know.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Annette, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I think this is a wonderful initiative, by the way, and so congratulations on it, and I wish you all the best. I want to, I'll see if I take half an hour, so I guess it all depends on how fast I talk sometimes, depending on how excited I get about the topic. It's a topic that's very important, very interesting, and it's one that I have, I guess, both kind of, I would say, professional interest in as well as personal interest in. So I thought what I would do is, first of all, begin by explaining, I guess, my perspective on Vatican II from where I stand or sit, I guess, depending on given the venue. And what I mean by that is from where I stand when I look at Vatican II, I think of it kind of at the intersection of my professional work, if you will. In other words, my work as a historian, and my field is what we describe as 20th century history, modern Europe, especially the era of the two world wars and the Holocaust, right? So I teach courses related to and focus mainly on the fascist Nazi period and then the Holocaust. And the research, my own research and teaching tends to focus on the Catholic Church and Catholic responses to the Holocaust, both before, during, and after. That's where my work currently sort of sits. But I say also, and I'll come back to that in the relevance of that in just a bit, but there's also a personal dynamic as well that I want to share. And as academics, we often don't do that. It's one of the reasons why I welcome this opportunity, is because I can kind of reflect on the relationship and the intersection of the personal and the professional for me. Because I am a Catholic who grew up in the 1970s and the 1980s. And so I guess I was part of that first generation of people who experienced, even without knowing it and without realizing it, some very profound and some would even argue some very radical transformations that happened, that came about in the Catholic world because of Vatican II. And as I say, I mean, we didn't really know it, and it's not like we talked a lot about it, but in certainly reflecting on how I was educated in my engagement. And keep in mind, I was in Catholic schools from in Ontario here, from elementary school right to my time at King's. I'm a King's undergraduate, class of 93. So and again, I want to make it very clear, I am a historian. I'm not a church historian, which means that I don't have any ecclesiastical training. I'm not a theologian. I don't have any kind of particular expertise in theology or ecclesiology. I'm a historian who studies, though, the Catholic Church and Catholicism, I guess, more generally, as a social, political, cultural actor and factor in the history of the period that I study, again, especially the era of the two world wars and the Holocaust. And so my work grapples with, among other things, the role of Catholic teachings and Catholic culture, Catholic practices in what we might describe as kind of a toxic mix of ideas and movements that helped in some ways to pave the way for fascism and Nazism, and played a role, of course, in the Holocaust, in the genocide of Jews in the Second World War. And so that's where my work is, and that's what I grapple with. But I grew up in a context, again, really that was informed by the changes that are wrought by the Second Vatican Council, which I'm going to explain in just a few minutes. What did that mean? Well, it meant that, for example, when it came to understanding the church's relationship to Judaism and the Jewish people, I mean, as I recall it, we spoke and we were taught and we engaged in a very, very obvious way, almost a kind of matter-of-fact way, a very comfortable way, acknowledging the Jewish roots of the church, the Jewishness of Jesus, the special relationship between the church and both Judaism and the Jewish people over time. Again, there was a real, as I say, sort of a kind of matter-of-fact comfort, almost a kind of natural understanding of the nature of that relationship. What that meant, though, in practice, as I think about it, when I think back on it, is that we didn't, in fact, talk a lot about the negative legacy, the negative, and it's hundreds of years, almost 2,000 years, in fact, of some very, very negative history, and in some cases, some very destructive and some very harmful history and harmful relationships in both formal ways that speak to institutional church, but also at the level of lived social experiences in communities where Jews and Catholics live together, especially in Europe, part of the world that I study. And so, in a way, for me, there's a paradox immediately when I think about the intersection of my professional and personal life, because the paradox is that, again, as I said before, it was a sign of the extent to which the church changed because of Vatican II, the way that we were taught. But it also kind of speaks to a certain rupture or a certain gap that opened up. I don't want to exaggerate it, but there was almost a kind of rupture that allowed us, as a generation of post-Vatican II Catholics, to grow up without really knowing very much about the previous history, and certainly not really having to grapple with it very much in terms of what that painful history was, what those dark chapters really represented. And it really wasn't until I started studying it and researching it and teaching it that I could almost sort of see the way in which those two different paths converged. So again, my work follows a certain trajectory as a historian, but I can never really quite escape that personal reflection and personal experience. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about that if we have an opportunity to do so. So the point is this, and I guess the main point, and it's one thing that if there's a thread that I want to sort of carry through my brief comments today, is that there is an inherent tension, contradiction, maybe many tensions and many contradictions around Vatican II. There's no question that Vatican II was arguably the single most impactful event and the single most impactful process in church history since the historic ecumenical councils of the earlier church history, not only going back to the Council of Trent in the 1500s, but further back in that. It really did fundamentally change the church and lay the foundations for Catholicism as we know it today. And yet, and this is again, I guess, the tension or the contradiction that I want to introduce to our discussion. Vatican II was and is kind of an open book in some respects, and by that I mean it's the site and the source of ongoing discernment and debate about what it was and about what it was meant to do. And those debates and that discernment, sometimes that conflict that comes from that, is really also more fundamentally about the church's understanding of itself, as well as the church's understanding of and its relationship to the wider world. So what I want to do, though, again, because I'm a historian, and what I really want to focus on, to me, three main themes for us to think about. The first, I want to very, very briefly cover what Vatican II was. In other words, what it was, why it was important. The second thing that we talk about is what Vatican II actually did. And again, just provide a very brief overview and summary of its main achievements, accomplishments. And then that feeds into the third theme, or third question for us. What was Vatican II supposed to do? And that's a question that I'm not going to answer in any kind of definitive way, because that's, again, I think, a question that is open in some respects. That's the source of discernment and debate and continued interpretation. And sometimes with some conflict, although what I hope ultimately is that by returning to its sources, by returning to its history, we can come to inform, our debates and our discussions today with some appreciation of what it was really all about. So I want to talk about what Vatican II was. Sorry, I'm going to jump around a little bit here. And why was it so important? Well, of course, what we call Vatican II is shorthand for the Second Vatican Council, or the Second Ecumenical Council of the Vatican, if we're going for more formal titles. As many of you know, it was called by the then newly elected Pope John the 23rd, who announced his intention to convene the council in January of 1959. That's just about 3 months after his election. And its work, though, took place over the span of years. In fact, there were 4 sessions that took place between 1962 and 1965. This slide here is a picture of the opening mass of the council in October of 1962. And we'll talk a bit more about who was there and what they did. But just again, it's important to note that the council's work closed formally in 1965. As probably many of you know, in the midst of the council, in fact, early on, John the 23rd passes away, leading to his successor, Paul VI, former Giovanni Montini. And it falls to Pope Paul VI, in fact, to see the work of the council to its conclusion. And in many respects, the whole of Paul VI's pontificate, which goes from 1963 to 1978, was really marked by the work of interpreting, diffusing, applying the council's main teachings and its structural reforms. And again, I know that is the source of debates and conflict, which are inevitable, I think, whenever we talk about the church's history. Again, whether we're talking about the nature of the church itself and its relationship with its constituent parts, or the church's understanding of and relationship with the wider world. It's probably useful to recall, just very briefly, what an ecumenical council is, or what it was. Remember, they gathered together mainly Roman Catholic leaders from around the world, and primarily bishops, is what we're talking about here. And I think there were upwards of 2,500 participants called to the council in the 1960s. And the purpose, of course, is to discuss major issues and to try to settle major issues of doctrine. And again, major issues around, I guess if you want to call them, both dogmatic as well as pastoral concerns and issues around belief, around the way belief is expressed, structured, as well as how the church is governed and how it relates to its, again, as I said before, its constituent parts, its own members, as it were. Prior to Vatican II, some of you know, there was you guessed it, Vatican I. Vatican I is famous or infamous, I guess, depending on one's perspective, for the teaching on papal infallibility from 1870. Of course, Vatican I was abruptly interrupted. In fact, its work was never formally concluded because of events in Italy around Italian unification. The very last act of the unification of Italy was the armed occupation, the armed seizure of Rome by Italian forces and Giuseppe Garibaldi. And that interrupts the work of the council. It also, of course, spells the end of the last papal state. The Pope, Pius IX, declared himself a prisoner of the Vatican, refused to acknowledge and engage the Italian state. It's significant. Not only did it mean that the work of Vatican I was not officially ever closed, but that rupture really does help to sort of set the tone for the church's relationship with the modern state well into the 20th century. And some of you know, of course, in 1929, a very, very small corner of the world, if you will, was given to the Pope in the form of Vatican City. Significant from the Pope's understanding because it restores a degree of territorial sovereignty that had been lost in 1870. And territorial sovereignty is important to the Holy See because it is seen as the basis for the autonomy and the independence of the Holy See and of the Pope in the exercise of his spiritual and pastoral functions. But that's a bit of Italian history that is important, but maybe the subject for another conversation. So again, we come back to the 1960s, we come back to Vatican II, about 2,500 bishops called to Rome. There were, of course, several 1,000 other guests invited, including many auditors. I found this really interesting picture of some female auditors. As many of you know, there were female religious invited. I believe, though, they were invited only to the starting of the second session. And I know that it was a source of some debate. There's a Canadian, in fact, I don't know much about the history here, but if you'll notice, there's a Canadian here from, I think, the Sisters of Immaculate Mary, if I'm not mistaken there. So they're there as observers effectively, as were many, many non-Christians and non-Catholics. This picture, I think, is an important reminder. I think we have to stop and acknowledge that as progressive as we might want to see Vatican II, and as important as it was, this was still the work of the male-dominated hierarchy. Right? This is still a church that excludes women in leadership positions, of course. And much has changed, but much remains the same. I'll leave there. Again, that's a source perhaps for us to discuss the extent to which Vatican II's spirit is lived in the Church of today and will be in the Church of tomorrow. But I wanted to acknowledge that important part of history. As I said before, there were non-Catholics and non-Christians also as observers invited to the council. And I think that reflected what was Pope John's, one of his main intentions was clearly reconciliation. That word reconciliation gets used a lot, but in lots of ways, some scholars would say it's really the major focus and maybe the single most important theme of the council. Reconciliation, the church reconciling itself to the modern world, in a sense, reconciling itself to its own nature, as well as reconciling itself with non-Catholic Christianity and, of course, non-Christian religions as well. And I'll come back to how that was manifested in the work of the council in just a minute. But again, I think reconciliation is important. In a sense, remember what the purpose is and the rationale is. Given how much the world had actually changed, and not only from the 1870s, but even in those years right after the Second World War, tremendous changes going on, wrought by the war itself, but also consider social and cultural changes that were going on around the world, decolonization around much of the world, social and cultural movements, the women's rights movement, for example, the sexual revolution of the 1950s and the 1960s. There was just so much ferment that was affecting not only the church itself, but the world, that I think one of the things that Pope John discerned was the need for the church, again, to figure out how to reconcile itself to the present day. I come back to Pope John with this slide because Pope John, sorry for jumping around here. Again, there's Pope John, il Papa Buono, as the Italians call him, the good Pope. An interesting figure, elected on the heels of a very long pontificate, Pius XII. Many of you know, of course, that Pope John's pontificate was expected to be fairly short and kind of a transitional papacy. It was short because he does pass away in 1963, but instead of being a transitional papacy, I think in many respects it really was a transformational papacy, and we have to acknowledge that. The announcement of the council does come as a surprise to many of the more powerful members of the Roman Curia. I should say, there had been talk of a council even under Pius XII, and some very, very preliminary work and preliminary discussions that had started even in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I don't think we appreciate the extent to which some of that work does make its way down to Vatican II. And so it's important to acknowledge, I know some people like to set up this very stark juxtaposition between the pre-Vatican II church and post-Vatican II church. And there are some important differences, but there were also some important lines of continuity. And there are some important seeds that are sown in the previous pontificate that may be worth discussing in some detail. I just want to draw your attention to that last paragraph there where I've quoted from John's rationale for calling the council. He says that he wants this council to bring forth a, quote, renewal of the spirit of the Gospels in the hearts of people everywhere, and the adjustment of Christian discipline to modern day living. And I think that, to me, that one very, very pithy phrase captures in some senses it's the key to understanding the council's purpose, its motive. This idea of the renewal of the spirit of the Gospels in the hearts of people everywhere. Notice this universal language, this opening to people everywhere. And at the same time, this referral back to Christian discipline, right? And what John wants is an adjustment of Christian discipline to modern day living. The question ultimately at the time of the council, through the council, and I think what still is with us today, if we debate what the council was meant to be, really focuses around this idea of what does that mean? What does it mean to speak about a renewal of the gospel? And what does it mean to speak about an adjustment of Christian discipline? And more importantly, how do you do it, Right? How does one actually achieve it? And so that's the central task: reform, renewal, adjustment, however we want to phrase it. That's really the challenge that the council sets for itself. I think the easiest way to think about what the council is doing, and I'm going to lean here on other scholars who studied and who were, some of whom were actually participants at the council themselves. Think of it as a kind of debate, or two different approaches that were used and were invoked. Again, but they're trying to get at the same issue of how do you get to renewal? How do you get to reform? What does that actually look like? And so probably the easiest way of thinking about it as these sort of divergent paths, or these distinctive paths, that ultimately, I think, are not mutually exclusive, but had to be reconciled. They had to be reconciled then, and I think in some ways they have to be reconciled on an ongoing basis if we think about the ongoing living legacy of the Second Vatican Council. And those two approaches can be very, very generally described as on the one hand, ressourcement, which was an approach advocated by some of the participants and experts who were at the council. That, again, the French word for, I guess, back to the sources. This approach essentially argued that one got to renewal and reform by returning to the roots, especially the scriptural and the patristic roots of the church. So it wanted renewal, but it, in a sense, let's say, going back to the future, I guess is one way of thinking, by rediscovering and reconnecting to the very early roots and the foundational moments of the church. The other approach is captured by the Italian word that's probably most often used when we talk about Vatican II, which is the aggiornamento, which means updating or bringing up to date. And again, I think aggiornamento can be understood in lots of different ways by people. But essentially, the idea there is, rather than going backwards, you have to kind of come to the present day and you have to look forward. So renewal and reform are going to be brought about by bringing practices and governing structures into line with present day values and present day norms. And again, I mean, we don't have a lot of time to go into it, but what I know about the council deliberations is that this was a real struggle. It was a real conflict, and it's, in a way, there's a lot of work that goes on before the sessions began. There's a lot of work that has to go on during the 4 sessions that ultimately produced the documents of Vatican II. Some historians and scholars would argue reconciling, resolving, working through that struggle was sort of that one central thread that kind of goes throughout the whole of the council's work in the 1960s. And I think, again, we could probably see the way in which that struggle, that basic question of how do you achieve reform and renewal, is one that we are still discerning and debating even in our own day. And I think, again, it's depending on where one stands, either in the church or outside of the church, that gets expressed in different aspects of contemporary Catholicism, whether it's liturgical practices, whether it's beliefs, whether it's church-state relationships, the role of the laity, the role of women in the church, so on and so forth. One can just imagine the range of issues where this tension is manifest, our bioethics, social justice, you name it. That's a bit of the very quick survey of the history of it. What does Vatican II actually do? I want to move on and talk about what Vatican II actually do. It's kind of stunning in lots of ways. It's really remarkable just how much Vatican II does. I've tried to put it in the slide here. There are 16 documents that are produced by the Council by 1965, and we know many of them by name. And depending again on our own vantage point, where we maybe have a connection to one over the other. There are 4 constitutions. 2 of them are dogmatic constitutions. 2 of them are pastoral constitutions. Essentially, the dogmatic constitutions on the church and on divine revelation are going, sort of looking at the nature of the church and its nature and structures. And then you have the one on liturgy and Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world, is the one that is most relevant to me in my own work. There were 3 declarations, again, declarations which really focused on specific issues, one on education, one on human dignity and on religious freedom, the Dignitatis Humanae, and then there's the Nostra Aetate. By the way, we just celebrated, or I guess are celebrating, the 55th anniversary of the Nostra Aetate, which really was a revolutionary declaration on the church's relationship with non-Christian traditions, especially Judaism. And I want to come back to the Nostra Aetate in just a minute. And then there were 9 decrees, and it covers the ground on just about everything. I've put a list here of some of the issues that are covered by ecumenism, the role of the laity. It's just, there's just about, I mean, the breadth of the scope, the range of it is really quite remarkable. And I think we need to sort of stop and take in just how much Vatican II was doing and trying to do. Now, the challenge that comes after 1965, of course, is interpreting and applying and diffusing the fruit of this work. And that's a process, of course, again, that's still very much ongoing. For me, the ones that I can speak to with some whether expertise is the word or some particular interest or perspective is these 3, the Gaudium et Spes, because again, that really fundamentally reconciles the church to the world, to the outside world, if you want. The Dignitatis Humanae on human dignity and on religious liberty. Very, very important declaration that, especially I think in the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust, really does see the church confront some very important themes. And then, of course, the Nostra Aetate, which radically transformed the church's relationship, or began to, let's say, it began to radically transform the church's relationship with non-Christian religions, and especially its special relationship with the Jewish people. Just a bit of background, and again, from my perspective, I've done some research and some work on the background of the Dignitatis Humanae. Really interesting to see here again what's going on in the church. This is where the history really matters, because it helps us to understand how much the church and the world are changing. Some of you may be familiar with the figure of John Courtney Murray, a prominent American Jesuit priest and a theologian. John Courtney Murray was maybe the single most influential source behind the drafting of and the success of the Dignitatis Humanae in 1965. And what fundamentally he advocates is the church reconciling itself to the world as it is. Not necessarily the world as people in the church wanted it to be, but the world as it was. And that meant reconciling the church with secularism, but especially religious pluralism, cultural diversity, and democratic institutions. I mean, Courtney Murray was an American, and he was accused of Americanism, which in Vatican circles was a bad word, and maybe still is in some circles. Which, in fact, Americanism was keyword for modern thinking, for modernism. They were quite often conflated. Just to measure how much things are changing and how rapidly they're changing. Through the 1940s and 1950s, Murray was constantly in trouble with the Holy Office because of his views, because of his writings, because of his teachings. And in fact, in 1954, he was formally censored for some articles that he wrote about religious liberties and a call for the church, again, to embrace the principle of religious toleration in a pluralistic society. And then think of it, a decade later, which isn't that long in the grand scheme of things, Murray is invited to the second session of the council, and he serves there as the Peritus, as an expert advisor. And as I said previously, he really plays a decisive role behind the scenes in helping to draft and then get approved the Dignitatis Humanae, which is really a very, very short declaration and one that's worth reading if you haven't had a chance to read it at all or recently. And its historic significance, it really does spell, I think more sharply than any other document, the church's embrace of human rights, and especially this principle of the notion that the right to one's religious beliefs was in fact an invaluable human right. It was part of one's human dignity. And that applied not just to Catholics, but also to non-Catholics. And it goes a step further and essentially says that governments, the state, have a responsibility to protect people's religious freedom, regardless of that of one's denomination. That wasn't what the church was advocating, just a few decades before. So it has tremendous significance in the short term and in the long term. And then, of course, there's the Nostra Aetate. And again, for someone who does work on Catholic-Jewish relations and on the Holocaust, this is often cited as again, we're celebrating the 55th anniversary of its promulgation and acceptance. Again, some of you are familiar with it. Again, very, very short document. I mean, I think it's 4 long paragraphs, essentially. It's not very long, and yet in some ways really, really profound. This is where the church essentially, first of all, it sees all that is good in what it shares in common with other religious traditions. But it has reserved some very, very special words for the Abrahamic traditions, Islam and Judaism. And of course, it has some very, very special and some very important words to say about the church's relationship with Judaism and with the Jewish people. And I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to get into some of the significance of it. I mean, there is, I think, a recognition there of the fundamental debt, if you want to use that word, that is owed the Christian church to its Jewish roots, to Judaism, and to the people of the covenant. So there's a church covenant dynamic relationship that's embraced. For me, what's truly historic is that there is here a repudiation of anti-Semitism, a renunciation of anti-Semitism. And for a historian who studies Catholic responses to and the role in Nazism and the Holocaust, that's important, right? Because it's something that had not been said in the previous generations. And so it's an important recognition. I want to be very, very clear because, it's radical. In some ways, it's revolutionary, and it will sort of set the church on a whole new path in its relationship with the Jewish people. But it's significant too, because there are certain elements of it that are somewhat conservative. This is not a document that really confronts, for example, the legacy of anti-Jewish practice and belief. Right? So it's again, I think they're about some of the tensions and contradictions of the Nostra Aetate. Really, really remarkable document, and I want to acknowledge that. It really does, in some senses, revolutionize the church's relationship to the Jewish people. And just to sort of close the circle, that's what I mean when I say I grew up in a church that was, I didn't know it at the time, but the fact that we spoke so little of the negative history, the negative legacy, in some respects reflected a very sincere desire on the part of the church in Ontario, where I was raised, to try to apply the insights and the teachings of the Nostra Aetate. And that's done, of course, with the leadership of bishops in North America, in Canada, and the United States as well. One last note I'll say on this: it's not all, a rosy picture. Many of us who do work on the Holocaust understand that there are many, many corners of the Catholic Church today where there is scant, very, very little understanding of Catholic responsibilities and Catholic role in what led to the Holocaust and in the Holocaust itself. And we know that there are still some very, very, in some circles, in some quarters of the Catholic world, a very persistent anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic strain. It needs to be acknowledged. So I just want to acknowledge that. I was part of a symposium at the U.S. Holocaust Museum just last week, in fact, and several of my colleagues and I had an occasion to acknowledge this basic reality. So I want to sort of wrap up. I've probably gone far longer than I should, Annette, but just really very briefly, the third question I asked is, what was Vatican II meant to be? What was it meant to do? That's what we're living with now. I mean, each of the popes from Pope Paul on have had to grapple with it, but the church itself has had to grapple with it, and the church's interlocutors in the world, whether they're in the world of interreligious dialogue or whether they're in secular institutions, have had to grapple with that question. Right? What are the dogmatic and pastoral legacies of the Second Vatican Council? And I know that there's a lot of noise and a lot of debate, even in certain circles, about Vatican II, about its legacy. Was it interpreted properly? What was it meant to do? Some have even asked, was it a mistake? Has it been misunderstood? Has it been manipulated? I'm really eager to hear what people have to say about where we are and where we stand. But what's clear is that the Vatican II is the church, and it's the history of the church, it's the teaching of the church. And so I think anyone who's in the church has to acknowledge and grapple with it the way that six subsequent popes have, as well as people in the church itself. I want to conclude by sort of sounding a note, again, by just how remarkable the Second Vatican Council was. I really want to underscore how historic it was, how transformational it was. The problem, and I think you could really argue that it sort of helped make sure that the church was engaged with its own members, but also with the world, and that there was a genuine and still an ongoing desire for sincere reform and renewal. The one problem I think that we have to acknowledge is that in lots of ways we're disconnected from its history. John O'Malley, who is another Jesuit and a prominent scholar, expert of the Second Vatican Council, laments the fact that so few young people in the church and outside of the church know very much about the Second Vatican Council. And what he says, and what I've captured in the slide here is that the Second Vatican Council is going from being experience and memory from those who lived it and those who tried to transmit it to history. Now, that's not a problem for me as a historian, except that the history is not getting taught, or the history is not being learned, if you will, however you want to phrase it. And that's a source of some concern, because if we don't understand its history, we really can't have, I think, an informed discussion over what Vatican II was meant to be and what it should be in the life of the church. So I'll end there, and really eager to have your questions and your own reflections and comments as well. So.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, you did a wonderful job, I think, of contextualizing Vatican II, and I think
30 minutes.
We've excellent. It's fantastic, and your time is great as well. So that's really exciting. I would love to hear what people are thinking, what questions people have, how our audience is interested in learning more and engaging more. So I see we've already had one question come in.
You'll just read that to me?
I'm going to read that to you, yeah. So, and this is right from the very beginning, actually, when you were speaking about the auditors that came to Vatican II. Jen is wondering, are auditors observers only, or do they have some duties too?
That's a great question. I don't have a technical answer to that question in terms of duties. They do have a role, and this is that they engage, they observe, they comment. They're allowed to offer advice and perspective. I'll defer to some ecclesiological expert on the actual word duty. I imagine that they would have certain responsibilities even from their own sending organizations. I guess what I know is that they were a part of the conversation, right? So they were part of the conversation. They were heard. Whether they were heard enough is, I guess, the subjects for some debate.
Yeah, thank you. What other questions do people have? I think there was so much that was raised there.
I mean, yeah, and I hate to. Sometimes I worry that you throw too much out. That it's so. I think experiences of their own, their own sense of its legacy and what it's supposed to mean. I guess I would be curious to hear people's own experiences.
Mm-hmm. And the boxes stay quiet. I think people are processing.
I can answer questions. I mean, in my own area is focused on the prehistory of it. So, especially if you have questions about the, that are related to those issues around Catholic-Jewish relations, around the church and the Holocaust, the Nostra Aetate, human rights.
We can cover it all. Oh, here the questions are coming in now. Okay, Rob. Mark is wondering, he says, thanks, Rob. Could you characterize the legacy of Pius XII in relation to Vatican II? Great
question. I just happen to know a thing or two about that. Characterize the legacy. Well, it's a contested legacy, I think, is the simplest answer, the shortest answer. And I don't usually give short answers. So I say contested legacy because, again, I think in some historical accounts, and maybe more in the realm of memory, people think of Pius XII as kind of the antithesis of Vatican II, right? In fact, sometimes just the two personalities of Pius XII and John XXIII are often held in juxtaposition. And again, if I can just relate a personal anecdote, I grew up in a house with an Italian Catholic mother, immigrant mother who adores John XXIII. So we had a picture of him in the house where I grew up. My mother still has that same picture up. I didn't know anything about Pius XII until I started studying the history. We never talked about him, never spoke about him. So it was almost like papal history starts with John XXIII. And I think for some people, there was a real dichotomy there. What I know and what I've studied is that, in fact, I think Pius XII, who was very suspicious about the idea of a council, nevertheless does push the church forward on some important issues. There are some important encyclicals. There are some important declarations that he makes or that others make in his name during his pontificate that sow the seeds for ideas that are taken up in Vatican II and at Vatican II. The Nostra Aetate is one of them. In fact, the Dignitatis Humanae. John Courtney Murray is insistent that Pius XII pushes the question along. He's pushing the church to sort of evolve its thinking on religious freedom, tolerance, the role of the state, So he doesn't, Pius XII is not a radical revolution. He doesn't go where John the 23rd goes, because Pius XII thought it needed a lot of time. But there's also, there's, for example, the important encyclical on biblical scholarship from 1942. And now the name escapes me. Someone, maybe Andrew will know what it is. It's just escaping me now. Important comments, though, that start to move the church away from the literalist interpretation of scripture to a recognition of the importance of hermeneutics, of biblical scholarship, biblical interpretation. Divina Fanti Spiritu. Thank you, Andrew. I see it in the chat box there. Again, that's a legacy of Pius XII, moving the church away from a literalist interpretation. So I'd say a contested legacy and a complicated one, but not always as advertised. So certainly more complex than sometimes the competing narratives have it.
Thank you. Marilyn asks, why do you think there is little taught about Vatican II?
That's a good question. I mean, there's little taught of Vatican II. There's little taught of history, of course. I'll get that in there. And I guess it's a question of where we expect Vatican II to be taught. Now, if we're talking about Catholic schools, it's a good question. I don't purport to know how it's taught or what's taught in Catholic schools in Ontario today. I know that we do teach it in some of our courses at King's. It's in different, especially I think in religious studies and over at the seminary as well. It's a very good question. I think probably it's part of a problem connected to almost a kind of bifurcation in church history. Church history seems to be something that's done by church historians in usually ecclesiastical institutions. One of the reasons why I'm at pains to underscore, I was not trained as a church historian. Right? That's formal training that I don't have. That to me is both a strength and a weakness for me, because there are things that a certain level of expertise of certain things that I don't have. But it's a strength in the sense that, or a virtue in the sense that it gives me a perspective kind of on the outside. So I think it's a problem maybe of how it's taught. The fact that it is not taught at all. In some ways, maybe just going to float this, Marilyn. Maybe in some ways, Vatican II is a victim of its own success. Again, I think about what I said earlier about the way we understood the church's relationships with Jewish people. There was such an emphasis on focusing on reconciliation that there didn't seem to be much room or enough room for an acknowledgement of and a study of some very, very difficult, painful history. So it's probably a number of different things. I mean, I don't want to go too far. I have certain views. There are, I think, some deficiencies in our formation. I use that word. I hope that doesn't get me into trouble. But it's probably, I think, connected to a bigger problem of not enough history taught in Catholic schools and Catholic culture. There's a rupture of a kind that we need to, I think, get our heads around.
Thank you. Andrea asks or says, what would I think it's probably what would you like to see the church expand upon? That is, if you could add to a document, what would you add?
Andrea's asked a very good question. of the Vatican II documents? Gosh. I think that's a great question, Andrea. I want to presume, but I think the Nostra Aetate. And again, I'm going to reflect here my own area of interest in my own research. Part of the problem with the Nostra Aetate is that it confines the issue of Catholic-Jewish relations, and especially when it comes to the issue of the legacy of anti-Semitism. It tends to relegate anti-Semitism to a modern secular racial problem. It does not do enough, I think, to acknowledge religious anti-Judaism, what we might describe, or the role that theological, doctrinal, biblical, not only interpretation, but beliefs and practices, even liturgical practices, the way that infused Catholic culture over centuries, and even into the 1920s and the 1930s. Do you know what I mean? It's a document that in some ways, it kind of provides, and this is still kind of the Vatican's take on anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. It sort of acknowledges that there are some Christians who didn't do what they were supposed to do, but it really wants to lay anti-Semitism and the Holocaust at the feet of a modern secular racist ideology, which it was. But it doesn't really go there when it comes to that more entangled and difficult history, which is kind of what I'm interested in, of how religious belief, doctrine, but also practice can fuel prejudice and exclusion on the ground. Because, at the end of the day, and I'm borrowing from a scholar, Omar Bartov, Jews in Europe are killed by their neighbors often in in their neighborhoods, in places where they live. We like to sometimes talk about, or we think about an aggressive Nazi state that comes in and occupies and then facilitates mass murder, which it does. But it does that often in many places with the collaboration of local populations or local governments. Many of them are Catholics. There are thousands of Catholic rescuers of Jews who risked their lives and who were killed for it. But there's a problem there of disentangling theology, belief, practices, prayer, liturgy with lived experiences on the ground. It's complicated, I know, but that's kind of what my research is. So I think the Nostra Aetate doesn't go there. I'm being long-winded here, but I think that's what I'm getting at when I say I look back at my own experiences. Again, I was invited as part of a number of us contributed to a book called Advancing Holocaust Studies. And I was asked as a historian who's also Catholic, just to reflect on my own personal experiences. And I reflected on that in a way, perhaps in a desire, maybe a well-meaning desire to focus on reconciliation. We've not done enough to confront in a transparent way that harmful legacy. And it still persists to this day, by the way, even if you read Pope Francis, whom I'm a very great admirer of, I think Pope Francis still doesn't quite go there. In fact, no Pope really has, in terms of embracing that question of the religious roots of anti-Semitism. But so it's a very long answer. Good question. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Rob. Jan asks, or says, how did the role of the laity change after Vatican II?
Again, great question. I think it's one that, I mean, I think church historians and theologians and ecclesiologists probably are better positioned to answer. So I'm going to answer you both from my own experience as well as from what I can see as a historian. I mean, I think probably most Catholics experience Vatican II's change probably through changes in the liturgy, right? Because we know famously the vernacular language, facing the people rather than facing east, right? The orient, the standing or the position of the celebrant. The music in church, I know it's a source for some people, and Janet perhaps can weigh in on this. So for the laity, in terms of lived experiences, that's probably one way. Of course, lay people have become and have been engaged, and Vatican II, obviously, in its decrees, in many different parts, in its constitutions and its decrees, opens the door to the laity, really underscores and emphasizes the fundamental role of the laity. So we know that lay involvement, lay action, lay participation has grown. We know that, again, depending what part of the church you're in, what part of the world, depending on even parish circumstances or diocesan circumstances, that laity involvement is greater or less. I guess it all varies. One question, I think, is whether the role of the laity has been fully understood, whether it has been fully embraced, whether it has been fully empowered. And again, I think that's maybe one of those unresolved questions where maybe the spirit and the meaning of Vatican II is an open question. Because especially, I think, at the level of power and deliberation and decision-making, I don't think I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but I think we still know that essentially at those highest levels of authority, that's still the preserve of ordained, the priestly ministry, and the church defends that position. I guess it's a question we should ask about whether, again, I think whether we've fully reckoned with what the laity are and what the laity should be. And we know, especially in a place like North America, in lots of ways, the 21st century is going to be the century of the laity, or it's going to have to be. Right?
Thank you. Robert says, I have read a little bit about an emergence of nuanced thought regarding the Second Vatican Council, in that it rejects so-called infallibilization of the council. That is, that Catholics are bound to accept every aspect of Vatican II's documents, as well as the idea of rejecting the council altogether.
Yes.
In other words, there seems to be an emergence of middle ground thinking in which the strengths and weaknesses of Vatican II are analyzed. Please comment on this.
That's a very good question. Again, I'm not going to comment as an expert on, because I think that really is a matter, I think, for those who are engaged in ministry or those who are engaged in the teaching of whether it's church history, theology, or other elements of it. I don't know, is it nuanced or not? I guess it all depends on one's perspective. I see some commentary on Vatican II that's kind of out there. So I do think there's a path forward, and I think that there is some sober reflection. I actually think you see it if you follow even the thought of both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. So I think this idea of not divinizing and you know, the council, I think that's very important. And again, as a historian, for me, that's easy because trying to divinize anything, I'll put my religious beliefs aside. But when it comes to councils like this, I know that they are a product of history. They may be, the church teaches also influences of the church, but they're also, and of the spirit, but they are also products of historical forces. So it's important not to divinize that. And yeah, I think it's true. I think that there is room, especially if you look at thinkers as what, you know, official and not, if you want. There's clearly room there for a good, sober discussion of, again, what Vatican II was, what it was supposed to be, what it should be. And again, I think that can happen. The question is it happening? Where does it happen? Again, I would have to defer to those who teach in this area to see what they're seeing on the ground. But I don't know if that's much of an answer for Robert, but I see it. I see it. I'm more worried about, and maybe I spend too much time worrying about some of the louder voices in the room that don't necessarily reflect where the church is, but
Yeah, thank you. Michael Roach says, I know this is interpretive, but I often hear that John 23rd was pending the church and Paul VI closed things to keep a rein on the expansion. Comment.
sorry, on the expansion of,
It just says keep a rein on the expansion.
okay.
Sorry, we'll have to.
Yeah, no, I think I understand. I think I think the idea here that John had a much more maybe is it radical vision? I don't know if that's the right word for it. Maybe a more transformation, that he wanted to go farther, in other words. Whereas Paul VI sort of reins it in. I think maybe that's part of the question. Again, that is a matter of interpretation. I think it's a matter that requires us to study much more in depth. And you know, as a historian who's waiting to get access to the archives for the Second World War, you know, there's only so much of that history that we can really understand from the public documents that are available. So I think probably in the next maybe 10, 15, 20 years, we're going to be able to see a little bit more about what really happened behind the scenes to understand. But I think the question gets to this tension that I alluded to earlier, that there were very strong tensions, in some senses pulling in very, very different directions in the debates in those 4 sessions. And the work of the council was constantly, I guess, about trying to reconcile. So if you want to think of it as kind of a, you know, pulling in these different directions, that was present, it was constant. And I think it's true, Paul VI has a job, and he sees it as his job to try to reconcile that. And it's interesting to see how it broke. In other words, what direction. I told the story of John Courtney Murray. I mean, a lot of people were against Courtney Murray, and a lot of people didn't want to see him succeed. His argument ultimately won the day because he had some powerful support behind the scenes ultimately, and mood was shifting. But there was a push and a pull constantly that Paul VI had to navigate. It's true. So again, I don't know if I would characterize it as Paul VI shutting it down. I mean, again, I think from a historical perspective, I don't think John the 23rd knew where it was going to go. I think John the 23rd knew that the church needed it. That was his insight. You might want to see it as divinely inspired. It was prophetic wisdom. It was good leadership. He understood that it was time. A lot of people thought it was too early. So he clearly had an intuition. Some might see it as divinely inspired, but even still, I think it showed leadership on his part. If we're sort of how to put it in secular terms, I don't know that he knew where it was going to go, or that he had clear ideas about where it was going to go. I mean, I don't think John the 23rd was a radical, like some people may want to make him out to be. But that's the tension, right? And it remains the tension over any number of issues, whether it's liturgy, whether it's liberation theology, whether it's, you know, issue teachings on human sexuality. It's the tension, right? And the tension is one we have to live with and embrace and work through.
Thank you. Maureen says, I am led to believe that there is a division within the Catholic Church between a very conservative movement in the church and the other Catholics, in quotes. Vatican II seems to have been a problem with the more conservative group. Can you comment on this?
I can. And again, I'm going to try to be careful because I want to be mindful of what I'm offering you are my perspectives. This is not necessarily in any kind of academic guise. So it's just my judgment on what I see. I think there is a divide. And again, I think that speaks to the problem of one of the questions previously asked about mythologizing the council. And I think mythologizing happens on all sides. I mean, I think some people mythologize it to be some kind of Woodstock for the church, right? And it's supposed to go really, really, which it wasn't. I mean, and John was not that kind of person. And the council fathers were not, some of them may have had views that were quite out there, but they weren't, do you know what I'm saying? I mean, so, on the other hand, of course, in an extreme, there are those who see it as kind of illegitimate almost. That's a dangerous vein. And I think that certainly is not, and again, I'll defer to those who have the expertise about the church's teachings, but the council is the teaching of the church. It's so it has authoritative weight. And I think anyone who suggests otherwise is not really in accord with that formal teaching. So what's unfortunate, I think, is the way that this happens with anything historical, right? It happens with monuments. It happens with debates around Sir John A. Macdonald or around figures like Pius XII. Sometimes there are social and cultural pressures and dynamics. And what we do is we use history and we use historical events or historical personalities, in this case, the council or the popes, to kind of work out some of those social and cultural battles. That's quite separate from what the history was and what the council was intended to be. But that divide is there. I think it's an unfortunate one. And I think it's a misreading. And if I just, one last thing, again, I don't want to get into the minds of the council fathers, but I do think that if you're looking for a theme from the council itself, again, keep in mind, there were very, very stark divisions. There were very, very sharp disagreements, but ultimately there was agreement. There was reconciliation. There was, again, people may not have been happy, but those tensions, and I mentioned before, just that tension between those two poles, the ressourcement and aggiornamento, they worked it out, right? And I mean, one of the fundamental jobs of the Pope, of course, is the unity of the church. And so it's an important thing to consider.
An anonymous attendee asked a question that I think you've touched on a little bit, but it might be worth just expanding a little bit. Often we hear that Vatican II hijacked the church. People even question its legitimacy. Can you say more about the context of what was going on in the church that led to the council?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I hinted at it before. There's a lot going on in the church and in the world, right? I mean, I think that the world had changed very much since Vatican I, and the church was changed and had changed. So, I mean, what are some of the big changes? I mean, there are demographic changes. There are social and economic pressures, social and economic movements. There is the Second World War and its aftermath. So, for example, that has implications on not only people's social relations, but it raised really fundamental questions about the dignity of the human person, about violations of human rights, about the treatment of religious groups and religious minorities. There was decolonization taking place in Africa and Asia, right? The church itself was becoming more global, right? What we now understand to be a global Catholic world was starting to take hold. There were obviously divergences depending on where you sat in the global Catholic Church between what's happening on the ground in places like North America versus Europe versus Africa versus Latin America. There's just so much. And I think that's why John recognized the need to address these fundamental changes. Again, so there are changes that affect the church itself and its nature, but also the changes that are coming from the outside world. And it's put the two together. And I think that was his intuition or his recognition, his judgment, that the time had come for that.
Okay. Thank you. Sandra Dunning writes, this is just a comment about my lived experience. I grew up as a Catholic pre-Vatican II, and I was exposed to a very negative view of other religions and was actually prohibited from attending any of the life ceremonies of non-Catholics, including weddings and funerals. Vatican II was transformational for me. I welcomed the teachings of Notre Dame. It was wonderful to be encouraged to learn about others and actually be invited on occasion to share in their worship. Thank you very much for shedding light on this very complex topic.
Thank you, Sandra. That's the lived experience that I'm interested to hear about more of. I mean, that's a lived experience that for historians actually helps us to understand. There's again, if I come back to the question of Nostra Aetate, and as I said, my own personal and professional work, there's the work of some of you know the name Sister Rose Thering, who's an American religious who worked tirelessly to address the issue of the church's teachings on Jews and Jewish people. There's a wonderful documentary about her work. And that was one of the first times I had ever heard what people who had gone to Catholic school in the 1950s, let's say if you've been here in Ontario, what they would have been taught about Jews and Jewish people, right, and Judaism, the language that was used. Of course, that was also part of the liturgy, right? There were prayers, of the famous or infamous prayer for Good Friday, where one prayed for the souls of the perfidious Jews for their conversion. And I mean, that was a part of many people's lived experiences and a part of their formation. And it was official, it was doctrinal, it was part of the education, it was part of prayer, part of worship. And that's the point. I grew up in a Catholic world where I didn't hear it. Now, again, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because clearly it still exists in parts of the Catholic world. But isn't it remarkable? Again, I started elementary school, I'm trying to remember what year it would have been. I guess it was 1970, 75, 74, 75. And I again, for this book, my contribution to this book about advancing Holocaust studies, I did have to think very intentionally about my experiences. We had sisters, we had priests, we had all of that training and that formation, and it was literally devoid of any of that anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish stuff that people would have been exposed to in an earlier generation. Again, it still is there. It's still in the Catholic world, but that's a profound change in the span of 20 years. Again, unfinished, but that's a big deal. And so that's why we talk so much about Vatican II. And it's imperfect, the work's still to be done, but that, again, as a historian, I can tell you, for things to change that dramatically in 20 years, it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, thank you. Another person asked, do you think that the Second Vatican Council was the death of mysticism associated with the liturgy of Mass?
I'm going to probably try to pass on that. I think I understand, and I want to be respectful of the perspective and the viewpoint. I think that I don't want to say that it was the death of, but I think I appreciate where the question comes from. I think it's from Chris. It's not, again, something I can speak to with any kind of expertise. I don't know whether the death of would capture it. As you know, there has been, and I think that one of the things that Pope Benedict in particular wanted to try to do was, and again, we had his critics, some of it was understandable, but part of it was this idea that perhaps some things went too far, and did you need to have something of a corrective, right? Again, I'm not going to pronounce on what that looks like. I just would call people back to the idea that the council is a living council. These documents are living documents. And here I'm taking off my hat as a historian and just putting on my hat as a Catholic. Those have to be constantly visited and revisited. So is it worth a discussion, again, about discernment and a debate about how we pray and about opportunities for maybe recapturing what may have been lost? Absolutely. I will only say that someone, again, born and raised and for whom that post-Vatican II Mass was my primary experience, it's not my experience personally. But again, I can't speak for everyone. So.
Okay, thank you. We have a few more questions that I think you've already actually answered. We'll take just a moment to pause. If anyone's got any other pressing questions that they need to ask right now, we have maybe 2 minutes left with Rob.
It's a great questions.
Okay. Well, I think everyone is thinking and reflecting on what you said. So let me take this time just to say thank you so much. I think you have given us so much to think about and so much really to be excited about and to look forward to, and to continue grappling with what we've, what Vatican II started, that we have really the privilege of living out and continuing to live out now. So thank you so much. I just see there's a couple more questions have just come through.
I mean, it really is a remarkable history. It's remarkable documents. They should be visited, revisited. And I don't, again, my job as a scholar is to sort of look at it from a certain distance, but it's a remarkable event. It's well worth our attention.
So people have just said thank you. So that's great. That's wonderful. Just a reminder for everybody, next week we will be back here, even though it is reading week, we'll be back with Professor John Dole from St. Peter's Seminary, and he will be talking to us about Christian hope and about Catholic hope. And what a perfect time to be thinking about hope in the midst of COVID-19 as we begin the winter months. So thank you so much for being here, and I really look forward to seeing you all back again next week. Take care. And thank you
Everyone,
once again, Rob.
thanks very much, Annette.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.